The candlelight flickered across Martha Blackwood's weathered hands as she lifted the loose floorboard beneath their marriage bed. 6 months had passed since Thomas died. 6 months of neighbors whispering about mill fever and how quickly it took the strong ones. 6 months of her 8-year-old Jacob asking why Papa never came home from his foreman shift that October night. Martha had avoided this hiding place, their secret spot, where Thomas used to leave her love notes during their courtship. Tonight, preparing to finally pack his belongings, she couldn't delay anymore. Her fingers found the familiar leather journal, bound with string the way Thomas always tied his work boots. The first pages held sketches of mill machinery, worker schedules, nothing unusual. But as she turned deeper, the entries grew darker. Names of workers who'd died, dates that didn't match the official records, chemical formulas written in Thomas's careful script, and then the final entry that made her blood freeze. October 15th, 1821. They know I know. Cornelius thinks I'm too simple to understand what they're doing to the water. But I've seen the barrels at midnight. Watch them dump the settling chemicals straight into the worker housing supply. If something happens to me, the proof is hidden where only Martha would look. The midnight bell tomorrow will signal their next move. God help them all. Martha's hands trembled as she realized Thomas hadn't died of mill fever. He'd been murdered for discovering the truth about what was killing her neighbors, their friends, their community. And tomorrow night, more would die. The church bell tolled 11 times in the distance. 1 hour until midnight. 1 hour until she had to decide whether to run or fight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martha Blackwood had never imagined herself a widow at 28, but then again, she'd never imagined many things about the life she'd built in the mill town of Riverside, Rhode Island. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of their 2-room cottage, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories. Constant reminders that Thomas should have been there to see them. She moved through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to carry grief like an extra burden. Coffee first, always coffee. Made strong the way Thomas liked it, before she remembered he wasn't there to drink it. Jacob's breakfast next, oatmeal, with a precious spoonful of molasses. When they could afford it, then the ritual of checking his temperature, his breathing, the color of his skin, searching for any sign of the mysterious illness that had claimed so many mill families. "Mama, why do you always look so worried when you touch my forehead?" Jacob asked, his dark eyes, Thomas's eyes, watching her with the unsettling perceptiveness of a child who'd grown up too quickly around adult fears. "Just making sure you're healthy, my love." Martha smoothed his unruly brown hair, the same cowlick that used to drive Thomas to distraction every Sunday before church. "Eat your breakfast. Mrs. Patterson is expecting us at the mill store this morning." The Riverside Cotton Mill dominated their world like a benevolent tyrant, its red brick walls and smoking chimney visible from every cottage window. For 15 years, it had provided steady work and modest prosperity to families who might otherwise have struggled as farmers on Rhode Island's rocky soil. Thomas had started as a spinner at 14, worked his way up to foreman by 25, and died at 31 with aspirations of someday owning a small piece of the company that had shaped his entire adult life. Martha dressed carefully in her second-best dress, black wool that had served for both Thomas's funeral and every Sunday since. In the mill town's delicate social hierarchy, a foreman's widow occupied a peculiar position, respected enough to shop at the company store without scrutiny, but not wealthy enough to avoid the constant calculations of stretching Thomas's final wages through another month. The walk to the mill store took them past the housing where the regular workers lived. Long wooden buildings divided into single rooms, each sheltering entire families. Martha nodded to the women hanging laundry despite the late November chill, exchanged quiet words about sick children and missing husbands. These conversations had grown increasingly frequent since Thomas's death, a steady drumbeat of loss that seemed to follow the changing seasons. Cornelius Blackwood emerged from the mill's main office, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as clearly as a uniform. By sharing Thomas's surname, he was only a distant cousin who had inherited the mill from his father and expanded it into one of Rhode Island's most profitable operations. How are you managing? And young Jacob? Growing so tall, Martha forced a smile. We're well, thank you, Mr. Blackwood. The company has been generous with Thomas's final wages. Thomas was a good man, a good foreman. Cornelia's pale eyes lingered on Jacob with an expression Martha couldn't quite interpret. These are difficult times for all of us. The cotton prices, the competition from the southern mills. We all must make sacrifices. Something in his tone made Martha's chest tighten, but she simply nodded and guided Jacob toward the store. She'd learned to navigate these conversations carefully, grateful enough to avoid seeming ungrateful, but not so dependent as to invite unwanted attention or advice. Inside the company's stores, she selected their modest supplies with practiced economy. Flour, a small portion of salt pork, lamp oil, and thread for mending. Jacob pressed his nose against the glass jar, filled with peppermint sticks, the same gesture he'd made every shopping trip since he could walk. One, Martha said quietly, fishing a precious penny from her purse. But only because you've been helpful with the wood splitting. Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife, leaned across the counter with the eager expression of someone hungry for conversation. Have you heard about the Henley boy? Took sick 3 days ago. Same symptoms as his father. Dr. Moore says it's the mill fever spreading through families now. Martha's hand stilled on her purchases. Mill fever? I thought that only affected the workers directly. That's what we all thought. But it's been taking whole families lately. The gardeners, the millers, even some of the supervisors' children. Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped to a whisper. My husband says Dr. Morse is baffled. Never seen anything like it. The way it strikes the strongest ones first. Outside, Jacob tugged at Martha's hand as they walked home. Mama, what's mill fever? Is that what Papa died from? Martha stopped walking, kneeling to meet his earnest gaze. How do you explain to a child that sometimes adults die for reasons no one understands? That sometimes the places that provide for families also take from them in ways that defy explanation? Papa got very sick very quickly, she said finally. The doctor said his body just stopped fighting. But you're healthy and strong, and I'm going to make sure you stay that way. But even as she spoke the words, Martha felt the familiar chill of uncertainty. Thomas had been healthy and strong too, right up until the morning they found him collapsed in their cottage, burning with fever and gasping for breath that wouldn't come. Dr. Morse had called it mill fever, prescribed rest and prayers, and Thomas had died within 2 days. Despite Martha's constant care, that evening after Jacob fell asleep, Martha sat at their small table with Thomas's final wages spread before her. Enough for perhaps 2 more months if she was careful, less if Jacob got sick and needed medicine. The numbers never balanced the way she needed them to, always leaving her short of the security Thomas had promised. When he accepted the foreman position, she pulled out Thomas's few personal belongings, his pocket watch, his Sunday hat, his leather journal filled with work notes and sketches. She'd avoided reading it, afraid of finding evidence of the dreams they'd never have a chance to pursue. But tonight, with winter approaching and their future so uncertain, she needed to understand what Thomas had been thinking in those final weeks. The early pages showed the methodical mind she'd fallen in love with. Detailed observations about mill operations, ideas for improving efficiency, careful calculations about cotton yields and worker productivity. Thomas had approached his foreman duties with the same attention to detail he brought to everything, from repairing their cottage's leaking roof to teaching Jacob to read. But as Martha read deeper, she noticed a shift in tone. The entries became less about operational improvements and more about concerns, questions about why certain workers seemed to get sick more often than others, observations about patterns that didn't quite make sense, and then, scattered throughout the later pages, names and dates that made Martha's chest tighten with recognition. These were the workers who'd died in the past year. Thomas had been tracking them, noting not just when they died, but where they worked, where they lived, what symptoms they'd shown. It read like the work of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Someone who saw connections others had missed. Martha closed the journal as the church bell tolled 10 o'clock. Tomorrow she would read more, when her mind was clearer and her heart was steadier. Tonight, she needed to sleep, to gather strength for the challenges that seemed to multiply with each passing day. But as she prepared for bed, Martha found herself thinking about Mrs. Patterson's words, about mill fever spreading through families, about the strange coincidence of so many deaths in a community that had thrived for decades. Thomas had seen something, had been tracking something, had died just as he was beginning to understand something important. The question that would keep her awake was simple and terrifying. What if Thomas's death hadn't been from mill fever at all? Martha's hand shook as she reread Thomas's final journal entry by candlelight, the words seeming to burn themselves into her vision with each pass. They know, I know. The phrase echoed in her mind like a death knell, transforming everything she thought she understood about her husband's death. She turned back through the pages with new eyes, seeing patterns she'd missed in her first reading. Thomas hadn't just been tracking worker deaths. He'd been investigating them. The careful notations weren't random observations, but evidence gathering. Dates when workers complained of stomach pain, times when certain barrels were moved through the mill yard at night, chemical formulas that meant nothing to Martha, but had clearly meant everything to Thomas. Entry from September made her stomach clench. Watched C and Dr. M move 3 barrels from the cleaning area to the worker housing after midnight. Same night the Patterson boy took sick. Coincidence? Testing water tomorrow. Another from early October. Water from worker housing shows residue I don't recognize. Took sample to Reverend Hayes. His books might have answers about industrial chemicals. If I'm right about this, it's not mill fever killing our people. It's murder. Martha's breath came in short gasps as the full implications hit her. Thomas hadn't died of some mysterious illness. He'd been murdered for discovering that workers were being deliberately poisoned, and the poisoning was still happening, still killing families, still killing fathers and mothers and children. While everyone blamed an imaginary fever, she thought of Jacob sleeping in the next room, of how many times she'd seen him playing near the water pump that served their section of worker housing. The same water pump that Thomas had tested, the same water they'd been drinking for months since his death. Rising unsteadily, Martha moved to the water bucket, staring at the clear liquid that suddenly seemed sinister. How many times had she boiled this water for Jacob's breakfast? How many times had she trusted it to keep them healthy, while it might have been slowly killing them? A soft knock at the door made her freeze. At this hour, after 10 o'clock, visitors meant trouble. Martha grabbed the poker from beside their small fireplace and approached the door carefully. "Mrs. Blackwood, it's Samuel Hayes." Martha opened the door to find the young reverend standing in the cold, his face etched with concern and something that looked like fear. Reverend Hayes had conducted Thomas's funeral service, had been one of the few people who seemed genuinely grieved by her husband's death, rather than simply going through the motions of community sympathy. "Reverend, what brings you here so late? May I come in? I have something I need to discuss with you about Thomas." Martha stepped aside, noting how Hayes glanced around nervously before entering, as if worried about being seen. She'd always thought him a good man, someone who actually cared about his Milltown congregation rather than simply collecting his weekly offerings and moral authority. "I've been struggling with something since Thomas died," Hayes said quietly, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his hands. "Something he asked me to research in the weeks before his death. I thought it was just curiosity at first, but now 3 more families have lost children this week, all with the same symptoms Thomas showed, all drinking from the same water sources." Hayes met her eyes with an expression of barely controlled anguish. "Mrs. Blackwood, I don't think your husband died of mill fever." Martha sank into her chair, Thomas's journal still open on the table. "You think he was murdered?" Hayes' eyes widened. "You know, I found his journal tonight. He was investigating the deaths, wasn't he? You were helping him. Thomas came to me 6 weeks before he died. He'd noticed patterns. Workers getting sick in clusters, always near certain housing areas, always after specific chemicals were used in the mill. He asked me to research industrial poisoning in my books to help him understand what might be happening. Martha turned the journal toward Hayes, pointing to Thomas's careful notations. He suspected Cornelius and Dr. Morse. The barrels moved at midnight, the water contamination. He was gathering proof, and then he died. Hayes sat heavily in the opposite chair. The night before, he was supposed to bring me his final evidence. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Thomas's pocket watch, still keeping perfect time on the mantel. Martha stared at it, remembering how Thomas had wound it every morning, how he'd taught Jacob to read the numbers, how it had stopped when he died and only started again when she'd wound it herself, as part of learning to live without him. "What do we do?" she asked finally. "I don't know." Hayes' honesty was both frightening and refreshing. Thomas was gathering evidence, but I don't know where he hid it. Without proof, we're just two people with suspicions making accusations against the most powerful man in town. Martha thought of Jacob sleeping in the next room, of all the children in the mill town drinking contaminated water while their parents worked to make Cornelius Blackwood wealthy. More people are going to die, aren't they? If Thomas was right, if someone is deliberately poisoning the water supply, then yes, more people will die until someone stops it. Then we stop it. The words came out with more conviction than Martha felt, but once spoken, they seemed to take on a life of their own. Thomas died trying to protect this community. I won't let his death mean nothing. He studied her face with something that might have been admiration. It's dangerous. If they killed Thomas for getting too close to the truth, they already killed my husband. They're poisoning my son's water. They're murdering my neighbors. Martha closed Thomas's journal with a decisive snap. I'm already in danger, Reverend. The only question is whether I'm going to hide from it or fight back. Where do we start? Martha considered the journal's contents, Thomas's methodical approach to investigation. We start where Thomas left off. We test the water, document the pattern of deaths, find the evidence he was gathering, and we do it quickly before they realize we know the truth. Outside, the church bell tolled 11 times. 1 hour until midnight. 1 hour until whatever signal Thomas had been expecting. Martha looked at Hayes with sudden urgency. Thomas wrote that the midnight bell would signal their next move. That was written the night he died. Hayes' face went pale. You think they're doing it again tonight? Poisoning more water? Martha was already moving toward her coat. I think if we want to catch them in the act, if we want proof that can't be dismissed or explained away, we need to be watching the mill yard at midnight. Martha, that's incredibly dangerous if they see us. If we don't go, more children die tomorrow. She paused at the door, looking back at Jacob's sleeping form visible through the doorway. I won't let them kill my son. The way they killed my husband. The decision was made. In less than an hour, Martha Blackwood would either find the proof needed to stop a killer, or she would join her husband in death. But she would not stand by and watch while her community was murdered for profit. The midnight bell would toll soon, and Martha intended to be listening. Martha and Reverend Hayes crouched behind the mill's loading dock as the church bell began its midnight count, each toll seeming to echo longer in the cold November air. Martha's breath came in small puffs of vapor as she clutched Thomas's journal, her other hand gripping the Reverend's arm with nervous tension. There, Hayes whispered, pointing toward the mill's side entrance. Moved. 3 figures emerged from the building, moving with the careful quiet of people who didn't want to be seen. Even in the darkness, Martha recognized Cornelius Blackwood's distinctive gait, the way he favored his left leg from an old riding accident. Behind him, Dr. Ephraim Morse's slight frame was unmistakable, followed by a third man Martha didn't immediately recognize. They watched as the men loaded wooden barrels onto a cart, the same type of barrels Thomas had mentioned in his journal entries. The work proceeded efficiently, suggesting this was a practiced routine rather than a first attempt. Where are they taking them? Martha breathed. For housing, if Thomas was right. Hayes pointed toward the long wooden buildings that housed mill families. The water pump served 6 families in each building. They followed at a careful distance as the cart moved through the mill town's narrow streets. Martha's heart hammered as she recognized their destination, the housing complex where the Henley family lived, where 3 children had taken sick in the past week. The same complex where her own cottage sat at the far end, where Jacob was sleeping in their bed. The men worked quickly and quietly, connecting hoses to the barrels and feeding them directly into the water system that supplied the housing. Dr. Morse consulted what looked like a pocket watch, timing the process with medical precision. Cornelius stood guard, his eyes constantly scanning for witnesses. Martha fumbled for Thomas's journal, trying to match what she was seeing with his careful observations. The process was exactly as he'd described. Barrels of chemical waste being dumped directly into the water supply that served mill families. Not accidental contamination from mill operations, but deliberate poisoning designed to look like natural illness. "We need to get closer," she whispered. "We need to see what's in those barrels." Hayes grabbed her arm. "Martha, no. If they catch us, if we don't get proof, who's going to believe us? Who's going to stop this?" But before Martha could move, the third man, whom she now recognized as Constable Pike, turned in their direction. For a terrifying moment she thought they'd been spotted. Then Pike simply nodded to the others and began walking patrol around the area, ensuring their operation remained unobserved. Martha and Hayes pressed themselves deeper into the shadows as Pike's route brought him within 20 feet of their hiding spot. Martha could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the casual way he rested his hand on his club. This wasn't law enforcement protecting the community. This was hired muscle protecting a criminal operation. The process took nearly an hour. Barrel after barrel was emptied into the water system while Martha watched in growing horror, calculating how many families would draw contaminated water in the morning, how many children would begin showing symptoms within days. Thomas's journal had documented the timeline. Illness typically appeared 2 to 3 days after contamination, death within a week for the youngest and oldest victim. When the men finally finished and departed, Martha and Hayes waited another 20 minutes before emerging from hiding. The water pump looked exactly as it always had, giving no sign of the poison that now flowed through the pipes that supplied Martha's neighbors. "What do we do now?" Hayes asked, his voice tight with shock and anger. "We document everything, times, dates, what we saw, and we test the water to prove contamination." Martha thought of Thomas's methodical approach, his careful gathering of evidence. "But first we warn people, starting with the families in that housing complex. Warn them how. If we tell them the water is poisoned, they'll ask how we know, and if word gets back to Cornelius that we were here tonight." Martha understood the dilemma. They couldn't warn people without revealing their own knowledge, and revealing their knowledge would make them targets for the same fate that had befallen Thomas. But they also couldn't stand by and watch families drink poisoned water. "We start with the families who trust us. People who knew Thomas, who know we wouldn't lie about something this serious." She thought of Mrs. Patterson at the company store, of the women who had brought food after Thomas's funeral. "We tell them there might be contamination in the water, suggest they draw from the well behind the church instead. We don't have to explain everything to start saving lives." The next morning brought new challenges. Martha sent Jacob to spend the day with Mrs. Patterson, claiming she needed to catch up on mending work. Instead, she met Hayes at the church, where they planned their investigation strategy, using his collection of books on chemistry and medicine. Thomas noted specific symptoms, Martha said, reading from the journal. Stomach pain first, then fever, then respiratory distress. Dr. Morse has been attributing it to mill fever, but these symptoms match chemical poisoning. Hayes had found references to industrial chemical disposal in one of his medical texts. Textile mills produce waste chemicals that are highly toxic if consumed. The normal practice is to neutralize them before disposal, but that costs money and time. It would be cheaper to simply dump them somewhere the mill owners thought no one would notice, except Thomas noticed, and now they know someone else might notice too. Martha looked up from the journal to find Hayes studying her with concern. "What do you mean?" "Think about it, Martha. Thomas died the night before he was supposed to bring me final evidence. That timing wasn't coincidental. Someone knew about his investigation, knew he was close to exposing them. The implication hung in the air like smoke. If Cornelius and his accomplices had killed Thomas to prevent exposure, they wouldn't hesitate to kill again if they discovered Martha and Hayes were continuing the investigation. So what do you suggest? That we stop? That we let them keep poisoning people? I suggest we be very, very careful about who we trust and how we gather evidence. Hayes closed his medical text with a decisive snap. And I suggest we contact authorities outside of Riverside, people who don't depend on mill profits for their livelihoods. But their careful planning was interrupted by urgent knocking at the church door. Martha opened it to find Mrs. Patterson, her face pale with panic. "Mrs. Blackwood, thank God you're here. It's Jacob. He's been asking for you. He woke up this morning complaining of stomach pain. And now he's running a fever." Martha's blood turned to ice. Jacob, the same symptoms Thomas had shown, the same progression that had killed her husband and so many others. She ran through the Milltown streets with Mrs. Patterson and Hayes close behind, her mind racing through terrible possibilities. Jacob had been drinking their water, the same water that came from the contaminated system, the same water that had been poisoned again just hours earlier. She found Jacob curled in Mrs. Patterson's bed, his small face flushed with fever, his dark eyes bright with pain and confusion. When he saw her, he tried to smile, but the effort clearly cost him. "Mama, my stomach hurts, and I'm so hot." Martha pressed her hand to his forehead, feeling the heat that meant his body was already fighting a battle it might not win. The same heat she'd felt on Thomas's skin in those final days. The same progression that had taken her husband from healthy to dead in less than a week. "It's going to be all right, sweetheart." The lie came easily, the way lies do when the truth is too terrible to speak. Mama's here now. But as she held Jacob's burning hand, Martha felt something change inside her. The careful investigation, the methodical evidence gathering, the plans to contact outside authorities, all of that suddenly felt too slow, too cautious, too likely to fail while her son suffered. Thomas had tried to work within the system, had tried to gather proof and follow proper channels, and Thomas was dead. Martha looked at Hayes over Jacob's head, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. They both understood what this meant. The poisoning hadn't stopped with Thomas's death. It had continued, expanded, claimed new victims, including the one person Martha couldn't bear to lose. "What do we do?" Hayes asked quietly. Martha smoothed Jacob's hair, the same gesture she'd made that morning when everything still seemed manageable. Now, with her son burning with fever from contaminated water, manageable was no longer enough. "We stop them," she said simply. "Whatever it takes, however dangerous it is, we stop them before they kill anyone else." Outside, the mill whistle blew the change of shift, calling workers to their daily labor in the building where their deaths were being planned. Martha listened to the familiar sound and made her choice. She would not lose Jacob the way she'd lost Thomas. She would not stand by while Cornelius Blackwood profited from murder. She would finish what her husband had started, even if it meant risking everything they had left. The investigation was over. The war had begun. Jacob's fever broke on the third day, but Martha knew they had borrowed time rather than won a victory. Dr. Morse's visit had been perfunctory, a brief examination followed by the same diagnosis of mill fever that had preceded Thomas's death. The doctor's pale eyes had lingered on Jacob with what Martha now recognized as calculation rather than medical concern, as if he were timing the progression of symptoms he had helped create. "He's lucky," Dr. Morse had said, packing his medical bag with brisk efficiency. "Sometimes the fever breaks naturally in the younger patients, but you'll want to watch for complications. Respiratory distress, stomach bleeding. Call for me immediately if his condition changes." Martha had nodded and thanked him, playing the role of grateful widow while fury burned in her chest. This man had poisoned her son, had murdered her husband, had killed dozens of mill families while masquerading as their healer. And he spoke of Jacob's recovery as if it were medical fortune, rather than the temporary reprieve of a child whose body hadn't yet absorbed enough poison to kill him. After Dr. Morse left, Martha met Hayes at the church to plan their next move. Jacob was staying with Mrs. Patterson, who had agreed to watch him without asking uncomfortable questions about why Martha suddenly needed to be elsewhere. During daylight hours, "I've been thinking about what Thomas wrote," Martha said. spreading the journal pages across Hayes's desk. He mentioned hiding proof where only Martha would look. I thought he meant our secret spot, but what if he meant something else? Hayes studied the journal entries with the focused attention that made him effective as both minister and now co-conspirator. What other places would be special to only you? Martha considered their shared history. The mill where they'd first met, the church where they'd married, the cottage where they'd built their brief life together, the bell tower where we used to meet before we were married, when I was still living with my aunt and uncle. The church bell tower, Martha, that's incredibly public. Anyone could see you climbing up there. Not during the day when everyone's working. And Thomas always said it was the one place in town where you could see everything but no one could see you. Martha felt the rightness of the idea settling in her bones. If he wanted to hide evidence somewhere, I'd think to look. Somewhere safe from search but accessible to someone who knew the secret. That's where he'd put it. They waited until midday when the mill whistle called workers to their shifts and the town settled into its daily rhythm. The church stood empty except for Hayes, who could legitimately be there for pastoral duties. Martha climbed the narrow stairs to the bell tower with her heart hammering, each step taking her higher above the mill town and closer to whatever Thomas had hidden for her to find. The bell tower was exactly as she remembered from their courtship. A small space dominated by the massive bell, with narrow windows offering views of the entire mill town. Martha had spent hours here as a young woman, watching Thomas walk to and from work, learning the rhythms of his life before they became the rhythms of their shared life. She searched methodically, the way Thomas would have taught her, behind loose stones in the wall, under floorboards, in the rope mechanisms that controlled the bell. Nothing. Martha was beginning to think she'd guessed wrong when her fingers found something unusual about the bell's mounting system. A metal box secured to the framework in a way that looked original but felt different. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth, Martha found Thomas's real evidence. Not just journal observations, but water samples in small glass bottles, each labeled with dates and locations. Chemical analysis notes written in Thomas's careful hand, comparing the contaminated water to samples from unaffected area, and most damning of all, a letter addressed to the state attorney general in Providence, detailing the poisoning operation and naming Cornelius Blackwood, Dr. Morse, and Constable Pike as co-conspirators. But the letter was unsigned and unsent. Thomas had died before he could complete his final step. Martha climbed down from the bell tower with evidence that could destroy Cornelius Blackwood and save lives throughout the mill town. But she also understood why Thomas had hesitated to send it. Accusations without legal protection were dangerous, and Thomas had no guarantee that authorities in Providence would act on the word of a mill foreman against one of Rhode Island's most successful businessmen. That evening, Martha and Hayes met in her cottage to plan their approach. Jacob was sleeping peacefully for the first time since his fever broke, his breathing steady and his color almost normal. But Martha knew that without stopping the contamination, his recovery was temporary. The next poisoning would be stronger, more concentrated, designed to finish what the first attempt had started. "We need to get this evidence to Providence," Hayes said, reading Thomas's letter for the third time. "But we also need protection. If Cornelius suspects what we know..." "He already suspects." Martha had been thinking about Dr. Morse's visit, about the way Cornelius had looked at Jacob outside the company store. "They're watching us, waiting to see if we follow the same path Thomas did. The moment we try to contact outside authorities, we become targets. So what do you suggest?" Martha looked at her sleeping son, then at Thomas's evidence spread across their small table. "We don't contact authorities. We force Cornelius to reveal himself publicly, in a way that can't be covered up or explained away." Hayes raised his eyebrows. "How exactly do we do that?" Thomas wrote that the midnight bell signals their next poisoning operation. They're going to do it again, probably soon, because Jacob's recovery proves their last attempt wasn't strong enough. Martha felt pieces of a plan clicking into place with almost mechanical precision. What if we were ready for them? What if we documented everything, gathered witnesses, made it impossible for them to deny what they're doing? "That's incredibly dangerous, Martha. If we're not caught, We save lives. If we are caught, at least we die trying to stop murderers instead of hiding from them." They spent the next 2 days carefully preparing. Hayes used his pastoral duties to visit mill families, documenting symptoms and gathering testimony from people who had lost loved ones to the mysterious fever. Martha tested water from different sources around the mill town, using Thomas methods to identify contamination patterns. What they found was worse than either had imagined. The poisoning wasn't random or occasional, it was systematic, targeting specific housing areas in rotation to avoid creating obvious patterns. Cornelius wasn't just disposing of chemical waste. He was using it as a weapon to control his workforce through fear and illness. Families who complained about working conditions found their water supplies contaminated within days. Workers who asked for better wages discovered their children developing mysterious fevers. Union organizers died of mill fever with suspicious regularity. The entire operation was designed to maintain Cornelius's control while providing medical cover for what amounted to systematic murder. On the third night, Martha's worst fears were confirmed. Jacob woke screaming with stomach pain, his fever spiking higher than before. This time, Dr. Morse's examination was longer, more thorough, accompanied by meaningful looks that Martha now understood as professional assessment of poison dosage and progression. "I'm afraid the fever has returned more aggressively," Dr. Morse announced, his tone suggesting medical helplessness rather than criminal responsibility. "Sometimes these cases develop complications. We'll need to monitor him very carefully over the next few days." After he left, Martha held Jacob's burning body and felt something fundamental shift inside her. The careful investigation, the methodical evidence gathering, the plans to expose Cornelius through proper channels, all of it suddenly felt inadequate against the reality of her dying child. Thomas had tried to work within the system and had been murdered for his efforts. Martha had tried to continue his work and had watched her son poisoned as a warning. The time for careful approaches and measured responses had passed. She looked at Hayes, who was reading Thomas's evidence by lamplight, his face etched with the same desperate determination she felt burning in her own chest. "There's something else in Thomas's journal," she said quietly. "Something I didn't understand before. He wrote about stopping time at midnight, about having a plan that would force the truth into the open, even if he didn't survive to see it." Hayes looked up from the papers. "What kind of plan?" Martha turned to Thomas's final entries, the ones written in the days before his death. He was a foreman. He understood how the mill's systems worked, how the water supply was connected, how the machinery operated. She pointed to a detailed diagram Thomas had drawn. What if he didn't just plan to expose the contamination? What if he planned to stop it permanently? As Martha explained what she thought Thomas had intended, Hayes' expression moved from confusion to understanding to something approaching awe. Thomas hadn't just been gathering evidence. He'd been preparing sabotage on a scale that would make concealment impossible. The question now was whether Martha had the courage to complete what her husband had started, knowing that doing so would either save the mill town or get them all killed. Outside, the church bell tolled 10 o'clock. 2 hours until midnight. 2 hours until Martha had to decide whether she was brave enough to stop time the way Thomas had planned. Martha was preparing to leave for the mill when urgent pounding at her door shattered the late evening quiet. Through the window, she saw Constable Pike's imposing silhouette, backlit by torchlight, accompanied by 2 men she didn't recognize. Her blood turned to ice as she realized their careful investigation had been discovered. "Open up, Mrs. Blackwood. Official business." Martha quickly gathered Thomas's journal and evidence, shoving them under Jacob's mattress as the pounding grew more insistent. She opened the door with what she hoped looked like sleepy confusion rather than terror. "Constable Pike? What's wrong?" Pike pushed past her into the cottage, his eyes scanning the small space with predatory attention. The 2 men with him spread out efficiently, clearly experienced in searches. Martha recognized them now as mill supervisors who occasionally did enforcement work for Cornelius. Men who understood that their comfortable positions depended on absolute loyalty. "We've had reports of suspicious activity around the mill," Pike said, his tone carrying the false authority of someone who enjoyed intimidating women and children. "Late-night meetings, unauthorized access to mill property. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "I don't understand." I've been carrying for Jacob since his fever. Where's the preacher? One of the supervisors interrupted. Hayes, we know he's been coming around here regular like. Martha's mind raced. If they knew about Hayes' visit, they knew about the investigation, which meant they'd been watching, waiting, allowing Martha and Hayes to gather evidence so they could be eliminated more efficiently. Reverend Hayes visited when Jacob was ill, to pray for his recovery. That's what ministers do. Pike moved closer, using his bulk to intimidate. That's not all he's been doing, though, is it? See, we found some interesting things in his church office. Notes about water testing, questions about chemical disposal. Seems the good reverend has been curious about things that ain't his business. Martha's heart sank. If they'd searched the church, they'd found Hayes' research, his copies of Thomas's observations, everything they'd carefully documented. The investigation was blown. But worse than that, Hayes was in immediate danger. I don't know what you're talking about, or you don't. Pike's smile was ugly with anticipation. But here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack up whatever you need for travel, and you and the boy are going to take a little trip away from Riverside tonight. Jacob's sick, he can't travel. Jacob's going to be a lot sicker if you don't cooperate. The threat was unmistakable. Dr. Morris's travel might be good for him. Change of air, different water. Funny how that works. The implication was clear. Leave town or watch Jacob die slowly from increased poisoning. Martha looked at her son's sleeping form, calculating odds and options with the desperate precision of a mother facing impossible choices. Where would we go? There's a boarding house in Newport. We're run by folks who understand the value of discretion. You'll be comfortable there while Jacob recovers from his illness. Martha understood. They were being exiled, separated from the evidence and the community, neutralized without the mess of additional murders. She and Jacob would disappear quietly, while Cornelius continued his operations without interference. And if I refuse, Pike's hand rested casually on his club. I don't think you want to refuse, Mrs. Blackwood, not with a sick child to think about. As Martha gathered their few belongings with shaking hands, her mind desperately sought alternatives. Thomas's evidence was hidden under Jacob's mattress. If she left now, it would be found and destroyed. Hayes was already captured, or worse. The systematic poisoning would continue, claiming more families while the mill town forgot that Martha Blackwood had ever tried to seek justice. But as she packed Jacob's clothes, her fingers brushed against something unexpected, tucked into the seam of his favorite shirt. A small piece of paper, folded multiple times, containing a message in Thomas's handwriting that she'd never seen before. Martha, if you're reading this, they've moved against us sooner than expected. The evidence under the mattress is decoy. Real proof is where we first said we'd love each other forever. The mechanism is set but needs final activation. Midnight bell tomorrow signals last chance. Trust no one but Hayes. All my love. T. Martin's hands trembled as she realized Thomas had anticipated this exact scenario. He'd planted false evidence for their enemies to find while hiding the real proof elsewhere. And he'd prepared something, some mechanism, that could still expose the conspiracy even if he didn't survive to see it. But where they'd first pledged eternal love wasn't the bell tower where they'd met secretly. It was the mill itself, in the small supervisor's office where Thomas had proposed after his promotion to foreman. The office that was now occupied during the day but empty at night. The office with direct access to the mill's water and mechanical systems. Time to go, Pike announced, clearly pleased with how smoothly the intimidation was proceeding. Martha looked at Jacob, still burning with fever from the poison these men had fed him, and made her decision. I need to say goodbye to Mrs. Patterson. She's been caring for Jacob during my difficulties. It wouldn't be right to leave without thanking her. Pike considered this, probably calculating whether allowing social courtesies was worth the risk of complications. 5 minutes. We'll wait outside. As Martha bundled Jacob in blankets and prepared to carry him to Mrs. Patterson's cottage, she palmed Thomas's hidden message and prayed that Hayes was still alive and free. Because if Thomas's final plan was going to work, if the midnight bell was truly going to signal their last chance for justice, Martha was going to need help, and she was going to need courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Outside, Pike and his men waited with the patient confidence of predators who knew their prey had no escape routes. They were right, of course. Martha was trapped, outmaneuvered, facing exile or death with a sick child and no apparent allies. But they didn't know about Thomas's final message. They didn't know about the mechanism he'd prepared. They didn't know that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who appears to have already lost. Martha carried Jacob toward Mrs. Patterson's cottage, her mind racing through possibilities and plans. In her pocket, Thomas's message seemed to burn like a promise. Midnight tomorrow would bring either justice or catastrophe, but it would definitely bring an end to the waiting. The only question was whether Martha would live to see which way the balance fell. Mrs. Patterson's cottage was dark when Martha arrived, but she could see movement behind the curtains that suggested the older woman was still awake. Pike and his men maintained their positions at a respectful distance, close enough to prevent escape, but far enough to avoid hearing private conversation. Martha knocked softly, and Mrs. Patterson opened the door with the quick alertness of someone who had been expecting trouble. "Martha, dear, I saw the men at your cottage." Her eyes flicked toward Jacob's fevered form. "How can I help? Take care of Jacob tonight. I may need to be away for a while." Martha lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "And if you see Reverend Hayes, tell him the midnight bell signals the final chance. Tell him Thomas left instructions where we first said, forever." Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened with understanding. She'd been married to a mill worker for 30 years before his death, had seen enough of Milltown politics to recognize the signs of dangerous knowledge. "I'll keep the boy safe, Martha. Whatever you need to do." Martha kissed Jacob's burning forehead, whispering a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "Mama will fix this, sweetheart. Mama will make sure you get better." She returned to Pike and his escorts, playing the role of defeated widow accepting exile. They escorted her to a wagon waiting at the Milltown's edge, where she was expected to climb aboard for the journey to Newport and enforce disappearance. But as Martha approached the wagon, she stumbled deliberately, crying out as if in distress. "My ankle. I think I've twisted it." Pike swore impatiently as Martha sat heavily on the wagon step, massaging her supposedly injured ankle. "We don't have time for this. Just give me a moment, please. I can't travel if I can't walk." As Pike and his men debated what to do about their suddenly incapacitated prisoner, Martha spotted a familiar figure moving through the shadows behind the mill's main building. Hayes, still free, still able to act. She caught his eye for just a moment, mouthing "Midnight Bell," before returning her attention to her performance of injury and helplessness. "Maybe Dr. Morse should look at her ankle," one of the supervisors suggested. "Make sure she can travel." "Dr. Morse is busy tonight," Pike replied with meaning that made Martha's stomach clench. If the doctor was busy, it probably meant preparing for another poisoning operation, another night of contaminating water supplies while the Milltown slept. After 15 minutes of Martha's deliberate delays, Pike's patience finally snapped. "Enough. Load her in the wagon. If her ankle's hurt, she can rest it in Newport." But Martha's delays had accomplished their purpose. Hayes had seen her message, understood the reference to where she and Thomas had first pledged their love forever. And the church bell had just tolled 11 times, giving them 1 hour to prepare for whatever Thomas had planned. As the wagon rolled away from Riverside, Martha felt a strange calm settle over her. She'd done everything possible to set Thomas's final plan in motion. Whether it succeeded or failed was now beyond her control. All she could do was trust in her dead husband's foresight and pray that his love for their community had been stronger than his enemy's greed. Meanwhile, Hayes moved through the Milltown shadows with purpose born of desperation. Martha's message had confirmed what he'd suspected from reading Thomas's final journal entries. The foreman had prepared more than just evidence gathering. He prepared sabotage on a scale that would expose the conspiracy to the entire state. The mail supervisor office was located on the second floor of the main building, accessible through a door that Thomas would have had keys to during his lifetime. Hayes prayed those keys were where Martha's message suggested, in the place where she and Thomas had first committed to each other. Forever. Inside the office, Hayes found Thomas's final preparations exactly as Martha had predicted. Hidden behind a loose floorboard were mechanical diagrams, chemical formulas, and a set of instructions written in Thomas's precise, Handwriting. The mill's water system connects to every housing area through a central distribution point in the basement. By reversing the pressure flow and opening the emergency drainage valves simultaneously, contaminated water will back up into the mill itself, flooding the main floor with undeniable proof of poisoning. The mechanism is prepared. Activation requires turning the main valve wheel exactly 7 full rotations clockwise at the moment the midnight bell begins to toll. This will force immediate investigation and make concealment impossible. Tell Martha I love her. Tell Jacob his father fought for justice. Hayes stared at the instructions, understanding both their brilliance and their danger. Thomas had designed a system that would literally flood the mill with its own contaminated water, creating physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. But activating it would require Hayes to be in the mill basement at midnight, exposed and vulnerable if Pike or his men discovered the plan. Outside, the church bell tolled 11:30. 30 minutes to decide whether to risk everything on a dead man's final gambit. Hayes made his choice. He gathered Thomas's diagrams and headed for the mill basement, praying that Martha's sacrifice had bought them the time needed for justice. In the basement, surrounded by the massive pipes and valves that controlled the mill's water supply, Hayes found Thomas's mechanism exactly as described. The main valve wheel was positioned precisely, ready for the 7 clockwise turns that would reverse the entire system. Emergency drainage controls were preset to open simultaneously, creating the flooding that would expose decades of systematic poisoning. As Hayes positioned himself beside the valve wheel, he thought about the families sleeping in mill housing, unknowing that their water supplies carried death. He thought about Jacob, burning with fever from contamination. He thought about Martha, exiled for seeking justice, and Thomas, murdered for threatening profits. The church bell began its midnight toll, each sound echoing through the mill basement like a call to judgment. Hayes gripped the valve wheel and began to turn, counting rotations as the mechanism engaged and water pressure began to shift throughout the mill's distribution system. 1 turn, 2 turns, 3 turns. Above his head, Hayes could hear water beginning to back up in pipes never designed to carry flow in reverse. The sound grew louder with each turn of the wheel, like a building storm that would soon break over everything Cornelius Blackwood had built through murder and deception. 4 turns, 5 turns, 6 turns. The basement began to flood as contaminated water erupted from drainage points, carrying with it the chemical evidence that would prove systematic poisoning. Hayes could smell the industrial contamination, could see the discoloration that marked water unfit for human consumption. 7 turns, the mechanism engaged fully as the midnight bell completed its 12th toll. Above Hayes's head, he could hear the roar of water flooding the mill's main floor, carrying with it proof that could no longer be hidden or explained away. Thomas Blackwood's revenge had begun. The sound of rushing water filled the mill basement like approaching thunder as Hayes completed the 7th turn of the valve wheel. Above his head, pipes groaned and burst as the reversed pressure forced contaminated water through systems never designed to handle backward flow. The basement floor became a toxic lake that rose steadily around Hayes's legs, carrying the chemical evidence of systematic murder. But Hayes' moment of triumph was shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps on the basement stairs. Through the flooding and darkness, he saw Pike's imposing figure descending, followed by Dr. Morse and 2 mill supervisors. They discovered the sabotage too late to prevent it, but not too late to eliminate the saboteur. "Should have minded your own business, preacher," Pike shouted over the roar of flooding water. "Now you get to drown in the same poison that's been feeding your precious mill families." Hayes backed toward the far wall as Pike and his men advanced through the knee-deep contaminated water. The basement was filling rapidly, but not fast enough to drive them back before they could reach him. He was trapped between toxic flooding and men who'd already committed multiple murders to protect their conspiracy. "You're too late," Hayes called back. "The whole mill is flooding. Everyone in town will see the contamination. You can't cover this up." "We don't need to cover it up," Dr. Morse replied with clinical calm. "Industrial accidents happen, mills flood, workers die, and sometimes curious ministers get caught in unfortunate circumstances." But as Pike reached for Hayes, the basement's far wall suddenly exploded inward as the mill's main water line ruptured completely. The force of the escaping water knocked Pike off his feet, sending him tumbling in the toxic flood, while Hayes clung to exposed pipes near the ceiling. Above ground, the mill whistle began blowing frantically as contaminated water erupted from every drainage point, every vent, every opening in the building. Workers arriving for the late shift found themselves wading through chemically tainted floods that carried the unmistakable evidence of deliberate poisoning. The smell alone, industrial chemicals mixed with organic contamination, made concealment impossible. Meanwhile, Martha's wagon had stopped 5 miles from Riverside. When her captors heard the mill whistle's emergency signal, the driver turned to Pike's remaining men with confusion. "What's that about? Mill whistle don't blow at midnight unless something's wrong." Martha feigned ignorance while her heart raced with desperate hope. The whistle meant Thomas's plan was working, meant the flooding had begun, meant evidence was finally being exposed, but she was still 5 miles away with Jacob burning with fever, still separated from the confrontation that would determine their community's fate. "Turn around," one of the supervisors ordered the driver. "We need to get back to town." As the wagon reversed direction, Martha saw smoke rising from Riverside's direction, not the normal smoke of mill operations, but the thick, chemical-laden smoke of contaminated water meeting heated machinery. Thomas's sabotage was succeeding beyond even his careful planning. Back in the mill basement, Hayes had managed to reach a maintenance ladder that led to the first floor, but Pike was close behind despite his earlier tumble. The contaminated water continued rising, now reaching chest height on the basement floor and showing no signs of slowing. "This won't save anyone," Pike gasped, struggling through the toxic flood. "Cornelius will rebuild. He'll claim it was sabotage, blame outside agitators. Your mill friends will still die, just slower." Hayes reached the first floor to find chaos beyond anything Thomas could have anticipated. The reversed water pressure hadn't just flooded the basement. It had ruptured every pipe, every connection, every junction in the mill's distribution system. Contaminated water poured from the walls like toxic rain, carrying with it decades of accumulated chemical waste that had been slowly poisoning the mill town. Workers and supervisors alike fled the building as the flooding spread, but many stopped to stare at the obvious contamination, the undeniable proof that their water supply had been deliberately poisoned. Wives arrived looking for their husbands and found instead evidence of the systematic murder that had claimed their families. Martha's wagon reached the mill yard just as Cornelius Blackwood arrived from his mansion on the hill, his face pale with rage and desperation as he surveyed the destruction of his carefully hidden conspiracy. The mill owner began shouting orders, trying to establish control over the chaos, but his authority crumbled as workers pointed at the contaminated flooding and demanded explanation. "This is sabotage," Cornelius shouted. "Industrial terrorism. Someone is trying to destroy our community's livelihood." But Martha stepped down from the wagon, Thomas's evidence clutched in her hands, and faced the man who had murdered her husband and poisoned her child. "This is justice," she replied, her voice carrying clearly over the chaos. "Justice for Thomas Blackwood and every worker you murdered with contaminated water." She held up Thomas's journal, his chemical analysis, his documentation of the systematic poisoning. Around her, mill families gathered as she read from his final entries, describing the midnight poisoning operations, the deliberate contamination, the conspiracy that had claimed their loved ones, while enriching Cornelius Blackwood. Dr. Morse tried to interrupt, claiming the documents were forgeries, but his protests were drowned out by the voices of families who had lost children, husbands, parents to the mysterious mill fever. The contaminated flooding provided physical proof that couldn't be dismissed, and Thomas's careful documentation provided the courage from the mill basement, waterlogged and furious, but found himself facing dozens of angry workers who now understood exactly who had been killing their families. His authority as constable meant nothing against the rage of parents who had watched their children die from deliberately poisoned water. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Cornelius tried to flee but was stopped by workers who had finally learned the truth about their community's supposed benefactor. Dr. Morris was surrounded by families demanding explanations for his false diagnoses and death certificates. Pike found himself disarmed and restrained by the same man he had intimidated for years. As dawn broke over Riverside, the mill yard resembled a battlefield flooded with toxic evidence. The contaminated water continued pouring from the damaged building, carrying with it proof that would ensure state investigation, federal oversight, and justice for decades of systematic murder. Martha knelt beside Jacob, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time since his fever began. The clean air and Thomas's vindication seemed to have broken the poison's grip on his small body. Around them, mill families began the process of rebuilding their community on foundations of truth rather than fear. Reverend Hayes emerged from the mill, soaked with contaminated water but alive and victorious. He had survived to witness the completion of Thomas Blackwood's final plan, a plan that had stopped time at midnight and changed everything that followed. The widow had indeed stopped time, but more importantly, she had started the future her husband had died trying to create. 3 months later, Martha stood in the same mill yard where Cornelius Blackwood's conspiracy had finally been exposed, but everything else had changed beyond recognition. State investigators had confirmed Thomas's findings. Federal authorities had arrested not just the local conspirators but suppliers who had provided the industrial chemicals used for poisoning. The mill itself was being rebuilt under new ownership, with worker safety protections that Thomas had only dreamed of. Jacob ran between the construction workers with the boundless energy of a healthy 8-year-old, his recovery complete once the contaminated water was replaced with clean supplies from outside sources. Dr. Morse's replacement, a young physician from Providence, had confirmed that Jacob's fever had indeed been chemical poisoning and that his survival was remarkable given the toxicity levels found in their housing area. "He's lucky to be alive," the new doctor had told Martha. "Whatever exposure he had should have been fatal. Someone must have been watching over him." Martha knew exactly who had been watching over Jacob, over all of them. Thomas's final plan had been more than sabotage. It had been salvation, a way to save his community even from beyond death. Reverend Hayes approached across the construction site carrying a letter that bore official seals. "News from the Capitol," he said with a smile. "The state is establishing new water safety regulations for all industrial towns. They're calling them the Blackwood Protections." Martha felt tears threaten as she realized Thomas's name would be remembered not for his death, but for the lives his sacrifice had saved. Children throughout Rhode Island would drink clean water because her husband had refused to let murder masquerade as progress. "There's something else," Hayes continued. "The new mill owners want to offer you Thomas's old position, supervisor of worker safety. They say they need someone who understands the cost of cutting corners." Martha looked at the rebuilt mill, at the clean water lines being installed, at the workers whose families would never again face deliberate poisoning. Thomas had dreamed of someday owning a piece of the mill that had shaped his life. Now Martha could help shape the mill that would define their community's future. "I'll consider it," she said, knowing she would accept. Thomas had started this fight for justice, but finishing it would require ongoing vigilance from people who remembered the cost of complacency. As evening approached, Martha and Jacob walked home past the memorial erected where the old contaminated water pumps had stood. The simple stone marker read, "In memory of all those lost to industrial greed and in honor of Thomas Blackwood, who stopped time at midnight so that justice could finally begin." Jacob touched the memorial with the reverence of a child who understood that his father had been a hero, even if he couldn't fully grasp the magnitude of Thomas's sacrifice. "Papa saved everyone, didn't he, Mama?" Martha squeezed his hand as the church bell tolled 7 times. No longer a signal for poison, but simply a marker of passing time in a community that had learned to value truth over profit, justice over convenience, life over wealth. "Yes, sweetheart, Papa saved everyone, including us." The widow who had stopped time at midnight had given her community something far more precious than revenge. She had given them a future worth living.